don't think there was ever a question about the fact that he was going to be good. I think that a lot of us didn't know for sure how good he was going to be.
I've always been a high ball hitter. I've been not necessarily the straightest driver in the world, but always had a lot of power. Being able to harness that power, being able to control it, being able to discipline myself to play.
PGA legends have revealed why they were genuinely terrified of Jack Nicklaus, but not for the reasons you might think. This wasn't fear of a bully or an aggressive competitor. This was something far more psychological, far more crushing. It was the fear of facing a man so mentally unbreakable, so statistically inevitable, that even your best golf might not be good enough. Arnold Palmer felt it. Gary Player acknowledged it. Tom Watson lived it. And what they discovered was that Nicklaus didn't just dominate golf. He rewrote the psychology of competition itself. When golf legends talk about being terrified of someone, they're describing a specific type of competitive dread. It's not physical fear. It's the mental weight of knowing that unless you play near perfect golf, you're already fighting for second place. That was the reality Jack Nicklaus created for an entire generation of champions. And the most remarkable part? The terror came from his excellence, not his intimidation tactics. Nicklaus forced every competitor to confront the absolute limits of their own mental strength. The story begins in 1962 at the U.S. Open at Oakmont. Nicklaus wasn't gently entering professional golf. He was making a statement. His very first professional victory came by defeating Arnold Palmer, the reigning king of golf, in an 18-hole playoff. This wasn't just a win, it was a declaration, and Nicklaus knew exactly what he was doing. Years later, he admitted that his focus that week wasn't the course. It was the competitor. He said the key was to beat Arnold Palmer. That was the key. That single moment shifted the entire hierarchy of professional golf. Palmer didn't get time to adjust. The competitive landscape changed overnight. For every established player watching, the message was clear. A new standard had arrived, and it came fully formed. The psychological pressure didn't build gradually, it started at maximum intensity, and it never let up. But here's where Nicklaus became truly different. His intimidation wasn't about trash talk or mind games. It was built on something far more brutal: cold, undeniable statistics. Numbers that created a feeling of mathematical inevitability. When you looked at a major championship leaderboard and saw Nicklaus's name, you weren't just competing against a great player. You were competing against the weight of history itself. Everyone knows Nicklaus won 18 major championships. That's the headline. But the real engine of his psychological dominance was something else entirely. He finished second in majors 19 times. Think about what that means. Across 37 total majors, he was either first or second. In the 76 majors he played during his prime, that's a 48.7% top 2 finish rate. Nearly half the time you had to beat Nicklaus to win, and the other half of the time he was still lurking somewhere near the top. His consistency went even deeper. Nicklaus recorded 73 top 10 finishes in majors and finished in the top 5 56% of the time. During the entire decade of the 1970s, he never once finished outside the top 5 at the Open Championship. Not once. 2 wins, 4 second-place finishes, and the rest in the top 5. Year after year after year. Imagine being a competitor during that era. Every time you teed it up in a major, you knew Nicklaus would be there at the end. You knew you'd have to be nearly perfect. And you knew that even perfection might not be enough. This created what researchers call competitive certainty. It's the psychological burden of knowing the outcome before it happens. Competitors entering majors weren't dreaming about holding the trophy anymore. They were calculating how to survive the mental strain of trying to outlast Nicklaus. The aspiration for victory had been replaced by the dread of another close call. Before we go further, drop a comment below. When you think about mental toughness in sports, who comes to mind? Let us know your pick. The numbers alone would have been enough to intimidate anyone, but Nicklaus had something even more powerful. A mental fortress that seemed completely impenetrable. He believed golf was 90% mental and only 10% physical. And he didn't just believe it, he lived it every single day on the course. David Graham, a top Australian professional, once said he never saw Jack Nicklaus lose his composure on the golf course. Not once. Think about the psychological impact of that. When you're grinding through a major championship, struggling with nerves and pressure, you look over at your biggest rival, and he's calm. Totally unnaturally calm. No frustration, no visible weakness. Just focus. Compare that to someone like Tiger Woods, who his own father described as having a volcano of emotion burning inside him. Tiger's intensity was visible. When things went wrong, you could see it. That gave his competitors something to feed off, some psychological relief. They could see he was human. Nicklaus gave them nothing. He was like a machine operating at perfect efficiency, immune to the emotional chaos that destroyed everyone else. This stoicism wasn't an act. It was a carefully developed strategy. Nicklaus understood something most golfers missed. He knew about what psychologists call the pink elephant paradox. If you try not to think about something, you end up thinking about it even more. Trying to control your thoughts actually builds tension and disrupts your swing. So Nicklaus didn't fight his thoughts. He focused on concentration instead. Concentration, in his view, meant accepting the result of each shot immediately and refocusing on the present moment. No dwelling on mistakes, no obsessing over water hazards, just pure focus on the task in front of him. While other players were trapped in mental clutter, activating parts of their brain that disrupted their motor control, Nicklaus stayed locked in. He had weaponized the fundamentals of sports psychology against players who didn't even know those fundamentals existed. His ability to close under pressure became legendary. He was known as a closer, someone who could drain impossible putts for par and raise his game when the stakes were highest. That clutch performance wasn't luck or talent alone. It was the result of superior mental training, and it created an impossible trap for his rivals. They could either lose focus through mental chaos, or they could try to force concentration, which only increased their internal pressure. Either way, Nicklaus had the advantage. Now let's look at how this played out for the legends who actually had to compete against him. Each one experienced a different flavor of terror. Each one had their confidence challenged in a unique way, and each one came away respecting the man who had pushed them to their limits. Arnold Palmer's experience was perhaps the most painful. Palmer was the king, the face of golf. His aggressive style and magnetic personality had made him a cultural icon. Then Nicklaus showed up and beat him in that 1962 playoff. The crown shifted, and it never shifted back. For Palmer, the psychological challenge was identity-based. He had built his entire competitive self-image around being the dominant force in golf. Nicklaus didn't just beat him occasionally. Nicklaus replaced him as the standard. Palmer started struggling to close out tournaments when he knew Nicklaus was on the leaderboard. The pressure wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about proving he could still compete with the new king. That's a much heavier burden. Eventually, Palmer recognized what made Nicklaus so effective. He noted that he never heard Jack Nicklaus or Tiger Woods say they were great players. They just got out and did it. And Palmer admitted that approach was far more appealing. It was a quiet acknowledgement that Nicklaus's mental game was simply superior. Gary Player had a different struggle. Player was part of the Big Three alongside Nicklaus and Palmer. He was a pioneer of fitness and mental preparation. If anyone should have been equipped to handle Nicklaus mentally, it was Player. He understood the importance of a strong mind. He trained for it. But even Player had to acknowledge the difference. He often cited Nicklaus's unparalleled focus and ability to raise his game when it mattered most. For Player, the competitive strain came from a painful realization. Despite his extraordinary mental preparation, despite his 9 major championships, Nicklaus had established an absolute performance ceiling. Player could reach incredible heights, but Nicklaus defined the top. That psychological hurdle, knowing someone was simply better at the thing you prided yourself on most, created its own unique form of pressure. Tom Watson became Nicklaus's primary rival in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Their relationship produced one of golf's most legendary moments, the duel in the sun at the 1977 Open Championship. This battle represents the peak of what it meant to compete against Nicklaus. It required sustained perfection, not just good golf, perfection. Watson had to make miraculous shots just to stay even, including a massive 60-foot putt on the 15th hole. During Saturday's round, Watson turned to Nicklaus and said, "This is what it's all about, isn't it?" Nicklaus replied, "You bet it is." That exchange revealed everything. Both men knew they were operating at an unsustainable level of intensity. The difference was that Nicklaus had been doing it for 15 years. The pressure on Watson was complete. Nicklaus, as people noted, would not beat himself. He simply didn't make the mental errors that opened doors for opponents. So Watson had to assume total responsibility for winning through flawlessness. One mistake and Nicklaus would capitalize. That reality defined Watson's entire competitive era. He had to be perfect to win, and perfection is exhausting. Lee Trevino handled the Nicklaus pressure differently. He made a famous joke that became his signature line. He said he was only playing for second place since Nicklaus was guaranteed to be first. On the surface, it sounds like surrender, but it was actually brilliant psychology. By preemptively conceding ultimate victory in his mind, Trevino lowered his own internal stakes. He detached his self-worth from the outcome. That freed him to focus purely on execution, rather than on the historical weight of beating the greatest player. This mental reframing was a defense mechanism, but it worked. Trevino was one of the few who genuinely thrived under Nicklaus's shadow, because he refused to let the terror affect him. He changed his goal, and in doing so, nullified the pressure. But the psychological impact of Nicklaus extended beyond the players who competed directly against him for majors. Some of the era's greatest players were crushed by something even more subtle. They were overshadowed not because they lost, but because they didn't fit the narrative. Billy Casper is the perfect example. Casper won 51 PGA Tour events, 7th all-time. He won 3 majors, including a legendary comeback against Palmer at the 1966 US Open. And here's the stunning part. From 1962 through 1970, Casper won 33 times on tour. Nicklaus also won 33 times during that same period. Identical output, yet Casper was perpetually overshadowed by the Big Three marketing push. The media, driven by entities like IMG, focused entirely on Nicklaus, Palmer, and Player. Casper Casper's excellence was culturally erased. Nicklaus himself acknowledged this, saying Casper was a fantastic player who didn't get enough credit. He noted that when you played against Billy Casper, Billy would not beat himself. For Casper, the competitive stress wasn't about losing to Nicklaus on the course. It was the realization that even massive success wasn't enough to escape Nicklaus's shadow. The psychological toll of being statistically elite but narratively ignored was its own form of terror. It suggested that greatness alone wasn't sufficient. You had to be great within the approved storyline, or your achievements would be forgotten. Johnny Miller faced a similar challenge from a different angle. Miller was one of the most talented ball strikers of the 1970s. His record-setting 63 at the 1973 U.S. Open showcased phenomenal skill, but Miller was competing during Nicklaus's peak consistency period. The challenge for Miller's generation was that Nicklaus had redefined what greatness meant. It wasn't enough to have moments of brilliance anymore. Nicklaus's extraordinary consistency throughout the 1970s, like never finishing outside the top 5 at the Open Championship for an entire decade, imposed a standard that demanded constant excellence. Miller had to sustain an impossible level of performance just to contend. Intermittent brilliance wasn't good enough. The psychological toll of trying to maintain that standard week after week, knowing Nicklaus was doing it effortlessly, contributed to the intense pressure Miller felt throughout his career. The environment Nicklaus created demanded perpetual peak performance, not cyclical highs and lows. So what made Nicklaus so terrifying? It wasn't one thing. It was 3 interconnected forces that worked together to systematically undermine every competitor's confidence. First, there was the statistical certainty. Those 19 runner-up finishes combined with 18 victories created a mathematical model that told competitors their optimal goal was usually to finish 1 stroke ahead of Nicklaus. They had to play with impossible precision because Nicklaus rarely slipped far enough back to create a margin for error. Every shot mattered because Nicklaus would be there at the end. Second, there was his mental resilience. His complete emotional stability and stoicism projected an image of immunity. Competitors searching for any sign of weakness found nothing. That absence of visible struggle amplified their own internal battles. They were fighting themselves and fighting the myth of Nicklaus simultaneously. His mental discipline became an offensive weapon that exhausted rivals without him having to say a word. Third, there was narrative dominance. Nicklaus's presence defined the historical conversation. Players like Billy Casper could match his statistical output and still be marginalized. This increased pressure on everyone else to participate in the great rivalry storyline just to ensure they'd be remembered. Success alone wasn't enough. You had to succeed in a way that fit the Nicklaus narrative. These 3 forces combined to create an environment of chronic competitive stress, decades of psychological drain, the certainty that aspiring to first place had been replaced by the reality of fighting for second, and the knowledge that even if you won, it might not matter unless you beat Nicklaus while doing it. But here's the remarkable truth that transforms this story from one of intimidation into one of elevation. The terror Nicklaus created wasn't destructive, it was transformative. He didn't break his competitors, he forced them to become the best versions of themselves. Think about it. Palmer, Player, Watson, Trevino, Casper, Miller, every single one of them achieved greatness specifically because they had to rise to Nicklaus's standard. They couldn't coast. They couldn't rely on talent alone. They had to develop mental toughness, strategic brilliance, and emotional control just to compete. Nicklaus elevated the entire sport by setting a bar so high that reaching it required total commitment. His legacy isn't just the 18 majors, it's the elevated standard he imposed. He proved that golf was overwhelmingly mental and that mastering that dimension could make you nearly unbeatable. He showed that consistency and composure were more valuable than occasional brilliance, and he demonstrated that true greatness meant performing at your absolute best when the pressure was highest. The legends were terrified of Jack Nicklaus because he represented the ultimate test. He was the measuring stick that revealed whether you had truly mastered yourself. And in forcing every competitor to confront the absolute limits of their mental fortitude, Nicklaus gave golf something priceless. He gave the sport a generation of champions who were tougher, smarter, and more complete than they ever would have been without him. If you found this deep dive into golf psychology fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more stories about the mental game that separates legends from everyone else. And drop a comment with your thoughts. Do you think Nicklaus's mental game was his greatest weapon, or was it something else entirely? Let's discuss the man who made an entire generation of Hall of Famers better just by showing up.